Daniel had planned the perfect day, but Isabella surprises him with an unexpected goodbye. Confused and devastated, he searches for answers at the cafe where it all began. There, he encounters a mysterious stranger who seems to know more than he should about their relationship. Who is this man? And how does he know so much? Now, Daniel must face a truth he never wanted to see. Can he save what's left? Or is it too late?
The rain fell in steady sheets, soaking everything around him, but Daniel barely noticed. He stood still, gripping a bouquet of lilies that were now starting to wilt in his hands. Today was supposed to be a celebration, a year since he and Isabella had first gotten together. He had planned everything perfectly. Dinner reservations at her favorite restaurant, the same flowers he'd brought her on their first date. But now, nothing was going according to plan. Isabella stood in front of him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shielding her body from the cold drizzle. Her eyes, however, remained distant and detached, focused on anything but Daniel. "We can't keep doing this, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking slightly, but her resolve was clear. "I can't do this anymore." Her words echoed in his mind, as if they were bouncing off the empty spaces that had suddenly formed inside him. He had heard her, but at the same time, he couldn't process the reality of what she was saying. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were happy, weren't they? He tried to speak, to argue, to ask why, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by the rising lump that threatened to choke him. "I thought," he began, but his voice trailed off, drowned out by the heavy rain. Isabella shook her head softly, as if she had already anticipated what he was about to say. "I need to go," she whispered, her eyes finally meeting his, filled with something that looked like regret. "Goodbye, Daniel." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her figure fading into the downpour. Daniel stood frozen in place, clutching the flowers tighter, his knuckles turning white under the strain. He wanted to chase after her, to tell her she was wrong, that they could fix whatever had gone wrong. But his feet refused to move, rooted to the pavement as though weighed down by the unbearable gravity of the moment. The streetlights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the now empty street, but Daniel remained there, alone. His mind raced, searching for answers that simply weren't there. How had it come to this? Everything had seemed so perfect just days before, yet now, he was standing in the rain, the love of his life walking away from him, and he didn't even understand why. The flowers, once vibrant and full of life, hung limply in his hand, now as lifeless as the hopes he had carried for them. He looked down at them, realizing how futile they were now. The rain wasn't just soaking his clothes and skin, it was soaking through his heart, each drop pushing him further into the cold reality he refused to accept. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something he could do. A desperate thought took root in his mind, growing stronger with every passing second. He couldn't let things end like this. Not without trying, not without at least one last effort to understand. He had to find her, talk to her, and figure out where it all went wrong. There had to be an explanation, and he needed to hear it. With a sudden rush of determination, Daniel turned on his heel, ignoring the chill that had settled into his bones. He would go to the cafe where they first met, the place where everything began. Maybe, just maybe, she would be there, waiting to give him one last chance. And if she wasn't, then at least he would know he tried. Daniel began walking, the flowers now clutched loosely in his hand, each step heavier than the last. The rain continued to fall, but this time, it couldn't drown out the sound of his resolve. The warmth of his apartment did little to ease the chill Daniel felt deep inside. He paced restlessly, the soaked bouquet discarded on the kitchen counter, its petals already wilting beyond salvation. His mind was a mess, replaying every moment with Isabella over the past year, searching for some clue, something that might explain how things had unraveled so quickly. They had been happy, or at least he thought they had. They had shared laughter, spontaneous weekend trips, and long, lazy mornings together. They were a perfect match, weren't they? But now, in the silence of his apartment, doubts began creeping in, filling the cracks that had been too easy to ignore before. Was there something he had missed? Had she given him signs that he simply refused to see? Daniel sank into the worn-out couch, head in his hands, trying to make sense of the swirling confusion. Maybe he hadn't been paying attention to the little things, the times she seemed distant, or the moments she brushed off his affection with a forced smile. He had been so sure of their love that he hadn't allowed himself to question it. Now, those same moments played back like broken scenes from a movie, sharp and unavoidable. Was he the problem? Had he pushed her away without even realizing it? He stood up, feeling a restless energy surge through him. Sitting here in his apartment wasn't going to solve anything. He couldn't change the past, couldn't go back and fix every little mistake. But he wasn't ready to give up either. Not yet. There had to be something he could do, something to show her how much she still meant to him. He wasn't ready to just let her go. His thoughts drifted back to the cafe, the place where they first met. That day had been perfect, completely unplanned, but magical. He had spilled his coffee near her table, and they had laughed together as he tried to apologize. It was the start of everything. Maybe the cafe could be a fresh start once again. He could go there now, wait for her, and if she came, maybe, just maybe, they could talk, really talk. Maybe he could find out what went wrong and show her that they could still fix it. The idea took root, growing in his mind until it became his only option. He grabbed his jacket, barely noticing the weight of the damp fabric as he threw it on. He would go, and if she wasn't there, at least he would have tried. He couldn't bear the thought of doing nothing, letting the love of his life slip away without one last effort. As he stepped out of the apartment, the cold night air hit his face, but this time, it wasn't enough to deter him. His feet carried him forward, each step a small act of defiance against the hopelessness that threatened to overwhelm him. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the city around him was quiet, almost peaceful. The cafe wasn't far, just a few blocks away, and with every step, Daniel's heart raced faster. He imagined her sitting there, waiting for him, maybe even regretting what she had said. He clung to that image, letting it pull him through the night. When he finally reached the familiar corner, the cafe's warm lights glowed softly through the rain-streaked windows. His heart jumped into his throat as he approached, peering inside, searching for that familiar face. But when his eyes landed on the small, cozy tables, there was no sign of Isabella. Instead, someone else was sitting at the very table where they had first met. A man, dressed casually, but with an air of confidence that seemed out of place in the empty cafe. He was alone, but his presence was striking, almost deliberate. And as Daniel stepped closer, the man looked up, locking eyes with him, as if he had been expecting Daniel all along. Confused, Daniel hesitated at the door. Something about the man's gaze sent a shiver down his spine. But he couldn't turn back now. Not after coming this far. He took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The soft chime of the bell above the door barely registered in Daniel's mind as he stepped into the cafe. His eyes quickly scanned the room again, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, Isabella was somewhere he hadn't noticed. But she wasn't there. Only the man remained, sitting at the table where Daniel and Isabella had shared countless conversations, laughter, and dreams. The man's gaze followed Daniel as he entered, his expression unreadable, though there was something unsettlingly familiar about him. Daniel approached slowly, his steps hesitant but driven by a need for answers. His heart pounded as if he was approaching a revelation, something he didn't quite understand yet. "Daniel, right?" the man asked, his voice calm, with a hint of knowing. Daniel froze in his tracks. How did this stranger know his name? He hadn't even spoken yet. The man gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Sit. You look like you have questions." Daniel's instincts screamed for him to turn around and leave, but curiosity held him in place. He sat down, feeling an inexplicable pull toward this stranger. The air between them felt thick with unspoken tension, and yet, the man seemed completely at ease. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice guarded, eyes narrowing as he studied the man. "Someone who knows a lot more about your relationship than you might think," the man replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Daniel's stomach tightened. The cryptic answer only fueled his growing unease. "What are you talking about? Where's Isabella? Do you know her?" The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I know enough, but I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about you. About Isabella. About what you think went wrong." Daniel recoiled slightly, but his need to understand overpowered the strangeness of the situation. "What do you mean what I think went wrong? She just left, out of nowhere, without any real explanation." The man tilted his head, considering Daniel's words carefully. "Are you sure? Did you really not see it coming? The signs were all there, but you chose to ignore them." Daniel opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. The man's words hit too close to home. He had been thinking the same thing earlier. Had he really been so blind? His mind flashed back to small moments, insignificant at the time, but now looming large with hindsight. The distant looks, the forced smiles, the moments when she seemed to be somewhere else entirely, even when she was right next to him. "I don't understand," Daniel muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were happy. I thought we were." The man sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Happiness is complicated. Sometimes, people drift apart even when they don't want to. Sometimes, they try to make it work, but deep down, they know it's not enough. And sometimes, well, sometimes love changes. Daniel shook his head, trying to grasp what the man was saying. But why didn't she say anything? Why didn't she tell me what was wrong? She did, Daniel, the man said, leaning back in his chair. Maybe not in words, but she did. You just didn't listen. Daniel felt a surge of frustration rise within him. What do you mean I didn't listen? I was always there for her. I loved her. I still do. The man's eyes softened, as though he understood Daniel's pain all too well. Love is more than just being there. It's about understanding, about paying attention to the things that aren't said out loud. You saw what you wanted to see, Daniel. But Isabella, she was struggling. Daniel's heart clenched at the man's words, and a flood of memories came rushing back. The little arguments, the times she seemed withdrawn, and how he had brushed it all aside, believing that their love could overcome anything. But now, sitting in front of this stranger, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. What do you want me to do? Daniel asked quietly, his voice laced with desperation. How do I fix this? The man smiled faintly, a knowing look in his eyes. That's something only you can decide, Daniel. But sometimes, fixing things doesn't mean going back. Sometimes, it means letting go. The weight of those words settled over Daniel like a heavy fog. He sat there, silent, as the realization began to sink in. Maybe this wasn't something he could fix after all. Maybe it was already too late. The cafe's warm atmosphere faded into the background as Daniel's mind drifted back to the beginning, the moments that, at the time, seemed perfect. He could see it so clearly now, as if he were reliving each day. The early days with Isabella were filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and spontaneous adventures. Everything had felt so effortless, so right. But as he replayed those memories, a subtle shift began to creep in. He saw moments that he had ignored, things he hadn't wanted to see at the time. Little details that were now impossible to overlook. There was that day when they were sitting in the park, the sun setting behind them. Isabella had seemed distant, her gaze fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. He had asked her if everything was okay, but she had just smiled faintly and said she was tired. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't wanted to spoil the mood. Now, he realized that it had been more than just tiredness. He remembered the dinner at her favorite restaurant a few months ago. They had been celebrating her promotion at work, a night that should have been full of joy. But he had noticed how distracted she was, her phone lighting up with messages that she hurriedly glanced at and then set aside. When he asked about it, she waved it off, telling him it was nothing important. At the time, he had believed her. But had it really been nothing? Or was that the beginning of her emotional distance? Daniel rubbed his hands over his face, trying to shake the nagging sense of failure that clung to him. He had been so focused on keeping the relationship alive that he hadn't noticed it slipping through his fingers. He had been blind to her growing unhappiness, assuming that love alone was enough to keep them together. But love, as the stranger had said, was complicated. Another memory flashed before him, one he had tried to forget. It was a week before their anniversary, and they had gotten into a small argument. He couldn't even remember what it had been about, something trivial, no doubt. But the way Isabella had looked at him during that argument, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place, had stayed with him. At the time, he had brushed it off, thinking it was just stress, a fleeting emotion. But now, he realized it was more than that. It was resignation. She had been slipping away, and he hadn't even noticed. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the table. How could he have been so blind? The signs were all there, yet he had chosen to ignore them, to convince himself that everything was fine. And now, sitting here, it felt like a cruel irony that only in hindsight could he see the truth. I thought I was doing everything right, Daniel muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. I thought we were happy. The stranger's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You saw what you wanted to see. And that was the painful truth. He had been so wrapped up in his version of their relationship that he hadn't stopped to consider how Isabella was feeling. He had assumed her silence was agreement, that her smiles were genuine. But they hadn't been, at least not entirely. As much as he wanted to go back and change things, to do things differently, the weight of regret settled in his chest, heavy and suffocating. What good were these realizations now, when it was already too late? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He quickly pulled it out, hoping it was Isabella, but it was just a message from a friend checking in on him. Daniel sighed, shoving the phone back into his pocket. Isabella wasn't going to text him. She had made her decision. Sitting there, in the same cafe where everything had started, Daniel began to understand just how much he had overlooked. But what could he do now? The past was the past, and no amount of reflection could change that. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, the soft patter against the windows matching the rhythm of Daniel's thoughts. For the first time, he began to wonder if this wasn't something he could save. Maybe the love they had shared had been real, but it had also been flawed, fragile. Maybe it wasn't enough anymore. The quiet of the cafe enveloped Daniel as the stranger watched him, as though waiting for him to process the flood of memories that had just washed over him. Daniel's head felt heavy with the weight of everything he hadn't seen, everything he had failed to understand. The questions that had been burning in his mind were now tangled with guilt and confusion. He finally broke the silence, his voice raw. "Why are you telling me all of this? How do you know so much about me, about Isabella?" The man leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I know what it's like to be in your position, Daniel. To feel like everything you believed in has crumbled. I know what it's like to think you're fighting for love, only to realize that maybe you never really knew the person you were fighting for." Daniel stared at him, trying to read the man's expression, but it remained calm, composed. "What are you trying to say?" Daniel asked, his voice almost trembling. "That I didn't know her? That our love was never real?" The man's eyes softened, but his words remained steady. "The love was real. It always is. But love evolves. People evolve. And sometimes, they grow in different directions, no matter how hard you try to hold on to what you had in the beginning." Daniel clenched his fists on the table. But if the love was real, then why didn't she tell me? Why did she let it fall apart like this? The man let out a quiet sigh, as if he had expected that question. "She did try to tell you, Daniel. Not with words, but with her actions, with the way she distanced herself. Sometimes, when people feel trapped, they don't know how to say what's really on their mind. And sometimes, they find someone else to talk to." Daniel's heart skipped a beat at those words, his mind racing. "What do you mean? Are you saying she was—" "No," the man interrupted gently, holding up his hand. "Not like that. There wasn't anyone else in the way you're thinking. But she did have someone she confided in. Someone who understood her in ways you couldn't, or didn't." A wave of shock and confusion hit Daniel. He had always believed he and Isabella were open with each other, that they shared everything. But now, the idea that she had been confiding in someone else felt like a betrayal, even if it wasn't romantic. "Who?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. "Who was it?" The stranger hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "It doesn't matter who it was. What matters is that she needed someone to listen, someone who wasn't tangled up in the emotions of the relationship, someone who could give her a perspective she didn't have with you." Daniel sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Isabella had been struggling, and instead of turning to him, she had found solace in someone else. He had been too wrapped up in his own view of their love, his own determination to make things work, that he hadn't even seen how distant she had become. The man continued, his voice steady but not unkind. "Isabella was hurting too, Daniel. She didn't know how to tell you that things had changed for her. Maybe she didn't want to hurt you, or maybe she didn't want to admit it to herself, but deep down, she knew." The anger that had been bubbling inside Daniel now gave way to a cold, empty ache. He had wanted so badly to fix things, to prove that their love could overcome anything, but it was becoming clear that it wasn't just about him. Isabella had been drifting away for longer than he realized, and he had been powerless to stop it. "So, what do I do now?" Daniel whispered, almost to himself. "How do I move forward when everything feels broken?" The stranger leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching Daniel's face. "You have a choice. You can keep fighting for something that might no longer exist, or you can accept that people change, and sometimes, the best thing you can do is let them go." Daniel's chest tightened at the thought. Letting go felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. But as he sat there, the truth of the man's words settled over him like a cold mist. Maybe the fight was over, and maybe it wasn't one he was meant to win. The stranger stood, pushing his chair back slowly. "I think you'll find the answers you're looking for, Daniel. But they won't come from Isabella. They'll come from you." As the man walked toward the door, Daniel didn't move. His mind was too full of everything he had just heard, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. When the bell above the door chimed again, Daniel didn't even glance up. He was alone with his thoughts, and for the first time, he began to understand that maybe letting go was the only way to truly move forward. The cafe grew quieter as Daniel sat motionless, staring at the empty seat where the stranger had been. The words echoed in his mind, refusing to leave him in peace. "You can keep fighting for something that might no longer exist, or you can accept that people change." Daniel's fingers drummed softly on the table, the subtle rhythm the only sound breaking the silence. He had come here hoping to find answers, to understand what went wrong between him and Isabella. And while the stranger had given him some semblance of clarity, it wasn't the kind of clarity Daniel had expected or wanted. He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, leaving him unsteady, unsure of where to go next. Letting go. The very thought was unbearable. How could he let go of someone he had spent the last year loving so deeply? How could he accept that their connection, once so strong, was now fractured beyond repair? But as he sat there, memories continued to flood back, memories of moments where, now that he reflected, he saw Isabella pulling away, inch by inch, in ways too subtle for him to grasp at the time. He remembered the night they had gone to see her favorite band. She had been quiet throughout the evening, lost in her own world. He had tried to pull her back with light-hearted jokes and playful gestures, but her smiles had been brief, never reaching her eyes. He had chalked it up to stress, thinking that once the music started, everything would fall back into place. But it never did. And now, looking back, he realized that night had marked the beginning of the distance that had grown between them. He had ignored it, just as he had ignored other signs. Every time she had seemed distant, Daniel had convinced himself that it was temporary, something that would pass. He had refused to acknowledge that maybe she was drifting further away, right in front of his eyes. The familiar ache of regret gnawed at him, a feeling he had grown all too accustomed to since Isabella walked away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and running his hands through his damp hair, trying to push back the overwhelming thoughts. He still loved her. He knew that. But was that enough? Could love alone fix the damage that had been done, especially when he had been so blind to what was happening around him? He wasn't sure anymore. The stranger's words came back to him again. Isabella was hurting too. She didn't know how to tell you. Daniel couldn't help but wonder if that was true. Maybe she had tried to tell him in ways he hadn't been able to understand. Maybe she had needed more than he could give. It wasn't that he hadn't loved her enough, he had. But love alone, it seemed, wasn't always enough. He had wanted to be her everything, but in doing so, he had failed to see that she needed space to be herself, to navigate her own emotions. He had been so focused on keeping them together that he hadn't realized he was suffocating the very thing he was trying to protect. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He had been fighting for something that was already slipping through his fingers, and in his desperation to hold on, he had missed the point entirely. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as if the answers might somehow be written there. He needed to figure out what came next. The idea of letting go still felt foreign, impossible even. But the alternative, clinging to something that was broken, chasing a relationship that might never be what it once was, seemed equally painful. The cafe door opened, and the sound of the bell rang out, briefly pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced up, but quickly returned his gaze to the table. His heart still ached with the longing to see Isabella walk through the door, to hear her tell him they could fix this. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. As the minutes passed, a sense of clarity began to creep in. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let go just yet, but for the first time, he was beginning to understand that holding on to the past wasn't going to bring him the answers he needed. He had been fighting a losing battle, not against Isabella, but against the reality of their relationship. Maybe, he thought, it was time to stop fighting. He stood up slowly, his body heavy with exhaustion, and headed for the door. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold and damp. As he stepped outside, the chill hit him again, though this time, it didn't feel quite as biting. Daniel paused on the sidewalk, looking down the street toward the direction of Isabella's apartment. A part of him still wanted to go to her, to ask for one final conversation, one last chance to make things right. But another part of him, a quieter, more rational voice, was telling him that it was time to walk away. He took a deep breath and turned in the opposite direction. The cold air wrapped around Daniel as he walked aimlessly through the streets, his thoughts spiraling in every direction. His mind kept bouncing between the idea of letting go and the desperate desire for answers. He had turned away from Isabella's apartment, but that didn't mean his heart had. Each step felt heavier, as though the weight of uncertainty was pulling him down. He wanted closure, something solid to hold onto, something to help him make sense of the mess in his head. Was it too much to ask for a simple explanation? For the truth, plain and clear, from Isabella herself? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that talking to Isabella was the only way he could ever find peace. He couldn't just walk away without understanding how everything had fallen apart. The stranger's words had offered some perspective, but they weren't enough. He needed to hear it from her, what she had been feeling, what she had been going through, and why she had left him standing in the rain that night without so much as a reason. The streets were quieter now, the rain having driven most people indoors. The occasional car passed by, its tires hissing against the wet pavement, but otherwise, the city felt almost eerily still. Daniel's footsteps echoed in the silence, his thoughts louder than the world around him. As he approached the park where he and Isabella used to take long walks, he paused, memories flooding back. It had always been their place to unwind, to escape the chaos of their lives for a little while. They would walk hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. That was the Isabella he missed, the one who seemed to find joy in the simple moments, the one who had once looked at him with eyes full of love. But now, standing there in the cold night, the park felt different. The bench where they used to sit looked unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else's memories. The tree under which they had shared their first kiss seemed smaller, less significant. It was strange how quickly things could change, how places once filled with warmth and laughter could now feel so distant and cold. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration gnawing at him. He had come so far only to feel even more lost. What was he really hoping to find here, retracing the steps of their past? He already knew that the answers weren't in these places, they were with her. Without another moment of hesitation, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over Isabella's name in his contact list. It had only been a few days since they last spoke, but it felt like a lifetime. His thumb trembled slightly as he debated whether or not to call her. What if she didn't want to talk? What if hearing her voice only made things worse? But he had to know. He couldn't move forward without understanding why she had left. Even if it hurt, even if it shattered whatever hope he had left, he needed closure. Daniel pressed the call button, his heart racing as the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity, his pulse quickening with each passing second. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the ringing stopped, and he heard her voice. Daniel? Isabella's voice was soft, hesitant. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and all the words he had been rehearsing in his mind vanished. All he could hear was the sound of his heart pounding in his chest, and for a brief second, he considered hanging up. But he couldn't. Not now. Isabella, we need to talk, he managed to say, his voice sounding more desperate than he intended. I need to understand what happened. I need to know. There was a long pause on the other end, and Daniel could hear the faint sound of her breathing. He waited, his breath caught in his throat, wondering if she would refuse, if she would tell him it was too late. I don't know if talking will help, Daniel, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if there's anything left to say. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he pressed on. I just need to understand, Isabella. I need to know if there's something I missed, something I could have done. Please. Another silence stretched between them, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might hang up. But then, he heard her sigh softly. Okay, she said, her voice tired. We can talk, but not over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow? Same place we always met after work. Daniel felt a small flicker of relief, but it was tempered by the weight of the conversation still to come. Yeah, I'll be there. Okay, she replied quietly. I'll see you then. As the call ended, Daniel stood there, phone still in hand, staring out at the empty park. Tomorrow, he would finally get the answers he needed. But whether they would bring him peace or more pain, he wasn't sure. The next day, Daniel arrived early at the park where he and Isabella used to meet after work. It was the place where they'd shared countless afternoons, decompressing from the stress of their daily lives. But today, the familiar bench felt foreign, a hollow echo of what it once meant to them. He sat down, his leg bouncing with nervous energy as he waited, unsure of what this conversation would bring. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Daniel checked his watch repeatedly, each glance only adding to his anxiety. What if she didn't show? What if this was her way of avoiding the inevitable conversation? He tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the last words they had exchanged over the phone. Finally, from across the park, he saw her. Isabella walked slowly toward him, her eyes cast downward, her posture tense. She looked different, not physically, but emotionally. There was a heaviness about her, a weight she hadn't carried before. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. He wanted to rush to her, to hold her like he used to, but that felt impossible now. Too much had changed. Isabella sat down beside him, but left enough space between them to make it clear that this wasn't the same Isabella who had once curled up against him on this very bench. She folded her hands in her lap, staring at them as if they might somehow provide the answers she was struggling to find. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, almost unbearable, but Daniel didn't know how to break it. He had so many questions, but now that she was here, they all felt too heavy to ask. It was Isabella who finally spoke first, her voice quiet and fragile. I know this isn't what you wanted, Daniel. I know this isn't how either of us imagined things would end. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to find his voice. I just don't understand, he admitted, his words tumbling out in a rush. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. What changed? Why didn't you talk to me? Isabella sighed, running a hand through her hair as she leaned back against the bench. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground. I tried, she said softly. I did, in my own way. But every time I wanted to talk, I didn't know how. I was afraid of hurting you, afraid that once I said it out loud, everything would fall apart. But it fell apart anyway, Daniel said, a note of frustration creeping into his voice. I don't understand why you couldn't just tell me what was wrong. We could have fixed it. We could have worked through it. Isabella shook her head, her expression pained. It wasn't that simple, Daniel. It wasn't something we could just fix. I started feeling trapped. I felt like I was losing myself in the relationship. I didn't know who I was anymore, outside of being with you. Her words hit him hard, and Daniel struggled to process them. Trapped? He had never imagined that was how she felt. He thought they were growing closer, not suffocating each other. You never said anything, Daniel whispered, his voice raw with emotion. I didn't know. How could I have known? I know, she said, her voice filled with regret. I didn't give you a chance to know. But I wasn't even sure how to explain it to myself, let alone to you. I kept hoping it was just a phase, that the feeling would pass. But it didn't. It got worse, and I didn't know how to stop it. Daniel looked away, staring at the trees in the distance, his heart heavy. You should have told me. You should have given me the chance to help you. Isabella wiped at her eyes, though no tears had fallen yet. I know. But by the time I realized how bad things had gotten, it felt too late. I didn't know how to bring it up without hurting you, without making things worse. And then, I found someone I could talk to. Not romantically, she added quickly, seeing the flash of pain in his eyes. But someone who understood what I was going through, who could help me make sense of it. Who? Daniel asked, though the name didn't really matter. He just needed to understand why. Just a friend from work, Isabella replied softly. Someone who had been through something similar. She helped me realize that it wasn't about you. It wasn't your fault. It was me. I needed space to figure out who I was, but I couldn't do that while I was with you. I'm so sorry, Daniel. Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs, the weight of her words settling over him like a thick fog. She hadn't left him for someone else. She hadn't stopped loving him, but she had been drowning, and he hadn't even noticed. He sat in silence for a long moment, trying to absorb the truth of what she had said. It wasn't about him. It was about her. But that didn't make it hurt any less. I loved you, Isabella, he said quietly, his voice shaking. I still do. I know, she whispered. And I loved you too. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes, it's not what we need. The finality of her words hung between them, a silent acknowledgement that there was no going back. The closure he had been searching for wasn't what he had expected, but it was clear now. Isabella had already made her choice, and there was nothing left for him to hold on to. I guess this is it, then, Daniel said, his voice barely audible. Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. I'm sorry, Daniel. I really am. He nodded, unable to find the strength to say anything more. Slowly, Isabella stood up, giving him one last look before she turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the bench. This time, Daniel didn't try to stop her. The air felt heavier after Isabella left. Daniel sat motionless on the bench, the world around him muted, as though the sounds of the park had faded into the background. The finality of their conversation echoed in his mind, each word replaying like a loop he couldn't escape. Isabella was gone, not just physically, but emotionally, from his life. He had come here for answers, hoping that understanding why she had left would bring some kind of peace. Now, as he sat alone, he realized that closure didn't erase the pain. It didn't magically make things better. The truth was hard to swallow, but it was real, and he had to accept it. For the first time since the breakup, Daniel felt the enormity of the situation sink in. Isabella wasn't coming back. Their relationship wasn't something he could fix, no matter how much he wished otherwise. All the love he had for her, all the memories they had shared, were now just pieces of the past, fragments of a life he needed to leave behind. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The grief was still there, lingering like a dark cloud in his chest, but beneath it, a strange sense of clarity was beginning to form. Isabella hadn't left because of some mistake he made, or because he wasn't enough. She had left because she needed to find herself, to rediscover who she was outside of their relationship. And no amount of love on his part could have changed that. That realization stung, but it also brought a measure of relief. It wasn't about fixing anything or proving his worth. It was about letting go of something that was no longer right for either of them. It was about accepting that their paths had diverged, no matter how much they had meant to each other. He opened his eyes and stared at the empty space where Isabella had been sitting just moments ago. It felt surreal to think that the person who had once been the center of his world was now just a memory, someone who would continue her journey without him. Daniel stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his legs from sitting for so long. He stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. He needed to leave this place, to walk away from this bench, this park, and everything it represented. It was time to move forward, even if he wasn't sure where that path would lead. As he walked, Daniel's thoughts began to shift. He had spent so long focusing on Isabella, on their relationship, that he had forgotten to think about himself. Who was he now, outside of the relationship? What did he want, and where did he go from here? The questions were unsettling, but they also felt necessary. Isabella wasn't the only one who needed to find herself. He had been so caught up in keeping them together that he had lost sight of his own needs, his own sense of identity. Now, without her, he had the opportunity to figure that out. The city streets were quiet, the fading light of the day casting long shadows as Daniel made his way back home. His mind wandered through a mixture of memories and possibilities, the pain of loss slowly giving way to the faintest glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: it was time to start thinking about what came next, time to rebuild his life without the weight of the past holding him down. As he turned the corner toward his apartment, the familiar ache in his chest remained, but it felt different now. It was no longer the desperate longing for what he had lost. It was the quiet, steady grief of acceptance, the kind that didn't paralyze, but instead allowed space for something new. Daniel paused at the entrance of his building, staring up at the windows that once held a sense of comfort and belonging. Now, they were just a part of his life that he had to reshape, one step at a time. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own set of challenges, its own share of healing. But for the first time in weeks, he felt ready to face it, to move forward without the weight of unfinished business dragging him down. It wasn't the closure he had imagined. It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation or the sudden realization that everything could be fixed. But it was enough. It was the kind of closure that allowed him to breathe again, to start thinking about his future, his own future. And that, for now, was all he needed. The morning light filtered through Daniel's apartment window, casting soft, golden hues across the room. He stood in the quiet of his living room, sipping coffee, staring out at the world waking up outside. It felt like any other day, but there was something different, something lighter in the air. For the first time in a long while, Daniel wasn't consumed by the constant replay of memories or the weight of unanswered questions. The conversation with Isabella had been hard, maybe one of the hardest moments of his life, but it had also given him a sense of finality he hadn't realized he needed. As he set the coffee cup down, Daniel glanced around his apartment. The space that had once felt so familiar now seemed like a blank slate, a canvas waiting for him to fill it with something new. There were still traces of Isabella everywhere, little reminders of their life together. The books they had read, the photos they had taken, the souvenirs from trips they had taken. It was time to let them go. He didn't need to do it all at once, but the first step was important. Daniel walked over to the bookshelf and pulled down a framed photo of the two of them, taken during one of their weekend trips to the coast. They were smiling, carefree, their arms wrapped around each other. At the time, he had believed that they would always have moments like that. Now, it felt like a relic of a life that no longer belonged to him. With a deep breath, he set the photo aside, knowing that there would be more things like this to let go of in the coming days. But it wasn't about erasing the past, it was about making room for the future. He grabbed his jacket, deciding that the apartment could wait. He needed fresh air, a chance to clear his mind and take in the reality of this new chapter in his life. The streets outside were already bustling with people, each of them absorbed in their own lives, their own stories. It was strangely comforting to see the world moving on, even when everything in his life had felt like it had been stuck in place for so long. Daniel walked without a destination, letting his feet guide him through the familiar streets of the city. His mind wandered, not in the frantic, desperate way it had before, but in a quieter, more contemplative way. There was no longer the constant weight of trying to fix something that was already broken. Now, it was about figuring out what came next. Eventually, he found himself near the cafe where everything had started. He hadn't planned on coming here, but it felt fitting in a way. This was where he and Isabella had first met, where their relationship had begun. Standing outside, he looked through the window at the tables, at the people inside who were laughing and talking, unaware of the significance this place held for him. Daniel smiled faintly to himself. The cafe hadn't changed, but he had. He no longer felt the pull to relive the past, to hold onto the memories that had once defined him. Instead, he felt a sense of closure, a quiet understanding that life would go on, with or without the things he had once held so tightly. He didn't need to go inside. He had already said goodbye, in his own way. Turning away from the cafe, Daniel continued down the street, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders with each step. The future felt uncertain, but in a way, that was exciting. For the first time, he wasn't looking back. He was looking forward. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a message from a friend asking if he wanted to grab a drink later. Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the simple act of connecting with people, of living his life outside of the shadow of his relationship with Isabella. He typed a quick reply, agreeing to meet up, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. It was a small step, but it felt significant. Life was moving on, and so was he. The day stretched out ahead of him, full of possibilities. And as Daniel walked further into the city, leaving behind the echoes of the past, he realized something important. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant making space for new memories, new connections, and new chances to find happiness. It wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning.